I thought my life was solid. If you'd looked at me and Jessica from the outside, you'd probably say we had it all. We met in college. She was studying marketing. I was in finance. She was smart, charming, and had this way of lighting up a room without even trying. When I met her, I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. We dated for 2 years, fell hard for each other, and eventually got married. We moved to the suburbs, bought a nice house, and settled into what I thought was the perfect life. In the beginning, everything was exactly how I dreamed. We had our daughter Emma a couple of years after getting married, and our son Jack followed a few years later. Those kids are my whole world. Watching them grow, seeing little bits of both of us in them, it made me believe that everything was going the way it was supposed to. Jessica became a stay-at-home mom when Emma was born. It was a joint decision. We both agreed that having her at home with the kids was worth sacrificing some of the luxuries we could have afforded if she'd kept working. I'd go to the office, put in long hours, and she'd be there for all the school drop-offs, doctor's appointments, and after-school activities. She used to tell me how much she appreciated the stability I provided, and I believed it. I worked long days, sometimes putting in 12 hours to make sure we were financially secure. I told myself that it was all for the family, that Jessica understood and appreciated the sacrifices I was making. She never seemed to mind, always saying how proud she was of my work ethic and dedication. I was proud of her too. She was an incredible mom, always doing something creative with the kids, making our home feel warm and happy. She was everything I thought a partner should be. But looking back, maybe I was too focused on my idea of a perfect family. Maybe I missed signs that something was wrong, signs that Jessica was slipping away from me. I didn't notice the little things, the moments where her attention seemed elsewhere, the way she'd started dressing up more when she'd go out, even if it was just to meet some friends for coffee. I brushed it all off as normal. I mean, what husband questions their wife going out with friends or taking extra time to look nice? I trusted her. And honestly, I thought that was enough. But a year ago, things started to change. Slowly at first, like a shift in the atmosphere that you can't quite put your finger on. Jessica started going out more, saying she needed time for herself, which I understood. Being a stay-at-home mom is no small job, and I knew she needed her own space. At first, it was just lunches with friends or the occasional girls' night out. Then it became more frequent. She'd go out several times a week, often not coming home until late. Sometimes, she'd say she was at her friend Lisa's house, watching movies or just hanging out. I didn't think much of it at first. We'd been together for so long that I never questioned her loyalty. In my mind, she was just Jessica, my wife, the mother of my kids. But there were moments that gave me pause. Like the night she came home smelling like a mix of alcohol and a men's cologne I didn't recognize. I made a light-hearted joke about it, trying to ignore the feeling of unease settling in. She just rolled her eyes and told me I was being ridiculous. But that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. There were other signs, too. Her phone, for instance. Jessica used to be the kind of person who'd leave her phone lying around the house. But now, she started keeping it on her at all times, even taking it to the bathroom with her. And whenever I walked by while she was texting, she locked the screen immediately. She started putting her phone on silent mode or turning it face down on the table, something she'd never done before. Again, I tried to brush it off. I'd tell myself I was being paranoid, that there was no reason not to trust her. But deep down, something didn't feel right. One night, I decided to bring it up. We were sitting in the living room after the kids had gone to bed. She was scrolling through her phone, her face lit up by the screen, and she was smiling. This soft, secretive smile I hadn't seen in a long time. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Jessica looked up, her expression shifting in an instant. The warmth in her eyes turned cold, and she rolled her eyes as if I'd asked something completely unreasonable. "It's just Lisa," she said flatly. "Why are you so interested in my phone all of a sudden?" "I'm not," I replied, caught off guard by her tone. "It's just, I don't know, you've been spending a lot of time out lately. I was just curious." "Well, maybe if you didn't work so much, you wouldn't have to wonder where I am all the time," she snapped, her voice sharp. The accusation hit me hard. I'd always believed that working those long hours was for our family, for our future. I thought she understood that. Jessica, come on, I said, trying to keep things calm. You know I'm doing this for us. I don't know. You're acting differently, and it's hard not to notice. She scoffed, shaking her head as if I were being unreasonable. I can't believe you're doing this, she muttered, standing up and grabbing her phone. I need some air. And with that, she stormed out of the house, leaving me sitting alone, staring at the empty space where she'd been. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening to us. I'd never seen her act that way before, so defensive, so distant. The Jessica I'd known all these years was warm, loving, and easygoing. This new version of her felt like a stranger, someone who had walls up that I couldn't get through. I tried to tell myself it was just a rough patch, that she was stressed, or maybe dealing with something she didn't know how to share. I convinced myself that everything would go back to normal soon, that this was just a phase. But things only got worse. She'd come home later and later, sometimes not even bothering to text me where she was. The few times I did ask, she'd brush me off with a vague answer or say she was at Lisa's. If I pushed for more information, she'd accuse me of being controlling or paranoid, making me feel guilty for even asking. She'd say things like, I can't believe you don't trust me, and maybe if you paid more attention, you wouldn't feel the need to ask. Each time she said it, I felt myself shrinking, questioning if maybe I was, in fact, being unreasonable. And then, there was the night of our anniversary. I'd planned a nice evening at home, hoping to reconnect and maybe talk about what was going on between us. I set up a nice dinner, candles, everything. I even arranged for the kids to spend the night at my sister's place so we could have some uninterrupted time together. I'd hoped it would remind us both of the life we'd built, of everything we shared. She came home 2 hours late, barely looked at the table I'd set up, and gave me a dismissive excuse about losing track of time with Lisa. I felt a sharp pang of disappointment, but I swallowed it, telling myself I shouldn't ruin the evening by arguing. We sat down to eat, but her attention was on her phone the entire time. Every time I tried to start a conversation, she'd just nod distractedly, barely engaging. Halfway through dinner, her phone buzzed, and she got up, saying she needed to take the call. She left the table and disappeared into the other room, leaving me alone, surrounded by candles and untouched food. I sat there, feeling like a fool. I knew, deep down, that something was horribly wrong, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. I didn't want to believe that the woman I'd loved for over a decade was slipping away, that maybe she'd already left and just hadn't told me yet. When she finally came back, I decided to confront her, to ask directly if there was someone else. She looked at me, her face a mask of irritation. Are you serious right now? She said, crossing her arms. After everything I've done, after all the sacrifices I've made, you're accusing me of cheating? I tried to keep my voice steady. Jessica, I'm not accusing you. I need to know if something's going on. You're not here, even when you're physically here. You're distant, distracted, and you're always on your phone or out with friends. I feel like I'm losing you. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. You're being ridiculous. Just because I have a life outside of this house doesn't mean I'm cheating. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with work, you'd realize that I need more than just a husband who's never around. Her words hit me like a slap. I'd always thought that working hard was part of my role, part of what made me a good husband and father. Now she was throwing it back at me, as if everything I'd done for our family meant nothing. Jessica, if you're unhappy, just tell me, I said quietly. Don't make me feel like I'm losing my mind. She didn't respond. She just shook her head and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone in the dim light, feeling like the walls were closing in. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, feeling the physical distance between us more than ever, I realized that the life I thought we had was gone. And deep down, I feared that I was about to find out just how broken it really was. After that night, things spiraled faster than I could keep up. Jessica and I were barely talking, and every interaction felt forced, like we were two actors in a play we didn't want to be in anymore. She was distant and cold, and every attempt I made to reach out, to ask what was wrong or how I could fix it, was met with disdain or outright hostility. I found myself second-guessing everything I did, wondering if I had somehow failed her without realizing it. I started paying more attention to her routine, to the little details I'd ignored before. I noticed that her girls' nights were becoming more frequent. Sometimes, she'd leave the house all dressed up in outfits I hadn't seen in years, wearing perfume I didn't recognize. She'd roll her eyes if I made a comment about how nice she looked, brushing me off with, "It's just what everyone else is wearing," or, "You wouldn't understand." Then, one Friday night, I found myself alone with the kids. Jessica had said she'd be out with Lisa again, which was starting to sound like a broken record. Something about her tone felt off that night, like she didn't care if I believed her or not. I remember sitting there, putting the kids to bed, feeling this emptiness settle in my chest. After they were asleep, I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, trying to drown out the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. Around midnight, I heard her come home. She was stumbling a bit, laughing at something on her phone. When she saw me sitting on the couch, her face dropped, and her laughter turned to annoyance. "What are you waiting up for me now?" she scoffed, swaying slightly as she kicked off her heels. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Jessica, it's late. I just wanted to know you were okay." She rolled her eyes. "God, you're acting like I'm some teenager sneaking out. I'm an adult, Jack. I don't need a babysitter." I watched her, feeling anger and hurt bubbling up inside me. Is it so wrong to want to know where my wife is, especially when she's out this late? "We have kids, Jessica. I just want to understand why you're acting like this." She stared at me for a moment, her expression cold. Then she shrugged. "Maybe I'm just tired of the same old routine. Maybe I need something more than just being a mom and a housewife." Did you ever think of that? I felt a lump form in my throat. I'd always thought she was happy with the life we'd built, that she found joy in our family, in our home. Hearing her say that made me feel like everything I'd worked for, everything I thought we'd wanted together, meant nothing to her. "Then talk to me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If you're unhappy, let's figure it out. I love you, Jessica. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." But she just scoffed, grabbing her purse and heading toward the bedroom. "You don't get it, Jack. I'm not some project you can fix." And with that, she shut the door, leaving me alone in the dark, wondering if I was losing her completely. The next morning, she was cold and distant again, acting as if nothing had happened. I tried to talk to her about it, to apologize if I'd somehow crossed a line, but she dismissed me, saying I was being overly sensitive. She left the house without another word, leaving me to deal with the kids and the lingering sense that something was slipping through my fingers. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica was hiding something. I started noticing little things, clues that painted a picture I didn't want to believe. Her phone would light up with messages late at night, and I'd catch her smiling at her screen, quickly turning it off if I walked by. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was wrong, but I was too scared to admit it. Then, one afternoon, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I'd left work early to pick up the kids from school, and as I was driving home, I saw Jessica's car parked outside a restaurant on the other side of town. It was the middle of the day, and I knew she didn't have any friends who lived in that area. I told myself she was probably just meeting Lisa or running errands, but curiosity got the better of me. I parked across the street and waited, feeling like a fool for even doing this. But then, I saw her. She walked out of the restaurant, laughing and looking far too happy for someone who just had lunch with a friend. And then I saw him, a tall guy with dark hair and a smug expression. He walked out right behind her, his hand resting on the small of her back as they laughed together. I felt my stomach drop, my chest tightening as I watched them walk to his car together. They didn't see me, didn't even look in my direction. I saw him open the door for her, saw her smile at him in a way she hadn't smiled at me in a long time, and it felt like my whole world was crumbling. I wanted to look away, to pretend this wasn't happening, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as they drove off together, leaving me standing there with the sickening realization that my wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted, was lying to me. That night, I waited up for her, feeling a mix of rage, heartbreak, and disbelief. When she finally came home, She looked at me with that same irritated expression she always used whenever I tried to ask her where she'd been. But this time, I couldn't hold back. Who was he? I asked, my voice barely steady. She blinked, caught off guard for a second. What are you talking about? The guy you were with this afternoon, I said, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. I saw you, Jessica. I saw you with him. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. But then, just as quickly, she crossed her arms, her face hardening into that familiar look of disdain. So what if I was with someone? Maybe I'm tired of being treated like a housemaid, tired of being stuck at home while you're out living your life. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jessica, I work hard to give us this life. I thought we were a team. I thought you loved me. She rolled her eyes, letting out a cold laugh. Love? Jack, you're so naive. I need more than what you're giving me. And frankly, I'm done pretending that I don't. Her words felt like a knife to the chest. I couldn't even process what she was saying. This woman, the mother of my children, was standing there, telling me that she didn't care, that she was done pretending. I felt a wave of anger and hurt so intense that I could barely stand it. Is this it then? I asked, my voice shaking. You're just done with us? She shrugged, looking completely unbothered. Maybe I am. Maybe I deserve more than what you've been giving me all these years. I felt something inside me snap. I'd worked hard, sacrificed time with my kids, put everything I had into making sure we were secure. And here she was, standing there like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. What about the kids, Jessica? I asked, trying to hold back the tears stinging my eyes. What about Emma and Jack? Don't they deserve better than this? She scoffed, rolling her eyes. They'll be fine. Kids are resilient. They'll get over it. And with that, she walked away, leaving me standing there, broken and defeated, as the reality of what had happened finally sank in. That night, I slept on the couch, feeling as if I were trapped in some kind of nightmare. I kept replaying everything she'd said, everything I'd seen, trying to understand how the woman I loved had turned into a stranger, someone who seemed to take pleasure in watching me suffer. After that confrontation, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I'd spent years convincing myself that Jessica was just going through a phase, or that we'd eventually work things out. But now I knew better. My wife wasn't just drifting away. She was actively destroying the life we'd built together. And she didn't care. The days that followed were a blur of anger and numbness. Jessica barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was like we were strangers. She'd be on her phone constantly, texting or laughing at messages, sometimes right in front of me. She stopped bothering to hide her late nights, and even when I could see her lying, she'd just give me this smirk, daring me to challenge her. I couldn't understand how she could be so cold, how the woman I'd spent a decade with could suddenly look at me like I was nothing. One night, a couple of weeks after our fight, I was putting Emma and Jack to bed. Emma looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes and asked, "Daddy, why is Mommy always mad at you?" It felt like a punch to the gut. How do you explain something like that to a child? How do you tell your kids that their mother is tearing the family apart? I gave her the only answer I could. Sometimes grown-ups just don't get along, sweetie. But no matter what, I love you and your brother very much. That will never change. After they were asleep, I sat in the dark in the living room, trying to gather the courage to take the next step. I didn't know what that step was, exactly, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The walls were closing in, and I felt like I was drowning. That's when I started considering the idea of divorce. The thought of it scared me, not just because of the logistics, but because I'd never imagined my life without Jessica. She'd been my everything for so long. But the woman she was now? I didn't know her. I didn't want to know her. She was cold, dismissive, and looked at me with contempt. It was like she had transformed overnight into someone else entirely. And for the first time, I thought about what life would be like if I left, if I took the kids and moved on. Maybe it would hurt, but at least I'd have my dignity. But as much as I thought about it, I still couldn't pull the trigger. Part of me kept hoping she'd snap out of it, that maybe this guy she was seeing was just a phase, and she'd come back to me. So I waited, hoping against hope that something would change. Then came the night everything finally shattered. Jessica had been out all day, saying she was visiting family. I didn't believe her, but I didn't have the energy to confront her anymore. I put the kids to bed alone, like I'd done too many times to count, and tried to keep my mind off where she might be or who she might be with. Around midnight, I heard her car pull into the driveway. She stumbled in, her hair messy, makeup smudged, and reeking of alcohol and that same cologne I'd noticed before. She looked at me, and instead of sneaking off to the bedroom, she just stared. "What?" she finally said, smirking as if she'd won some twisted game. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice hollow. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear her say it. She laughed, a cold, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, come on, Jack. You're not that clueless. Why do you even care?" I felt a rush of anger, so intense it made my hands shake. "Because you're my wife, Jessica. Because we have kids. Because I deserve to know what's happening in my own house." She rolled her eyes, unbothered. "Your house?" "Our house, Jack. And besides, what are you going to do about it? Keep sitting here like a sad little puppy, waiting for me to come home?" That broke me. For so long, I'd been the one trying to keep things together, the one willing to forgive, to compromise, to look past her behavior for the sake of our family. But her words made it clear. She didn't care. She'd given up on us a long time ago, and now she was just taunting me, as if daring me to do something about it. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back the anger bubbling inside me. "Do you even feel guilty, Jessica? Do you even care about the kids, about what you're doing to our family?" She shrugged, her expression cold. "The kids will be fine. They don't need you hovering over them like some overprotective dad. And as for guilt, you're the one who pushed me to this, Jack. You with your long hours, I'm doing this for the family crap. Maybe if you'd been around more, I wouldn't have needed to find someone else." I was speechless. I'd worked long hours, yes, but it was to give us the life she'd always said she wanted. I'd thought I was being a good husband, a good father. I was blindsided by her accusation, by the sheer cruelty of her words. And then she said something I will never forget. She walked over to me, standing so close I could smell the alcohol on her breath. Her eyes were cold, almost amused, as if this was all some kind of sick game to her. She leaned in and whispered, "You're going to die soon anyway, so there's no point in hiding my affairs anymore." I froze, staring at her, trying to process what she just said. I'd had a health scare a year before, something minor that had required a few follow-ups, but nothing serious. It was the kind of thing that makes you stop and think, but not something I'd ever worried about. But hearing her say that, hearing the contempt in her voice, the coldness, it broke something inside me. I couldn't believe this was my wife, the mother of my children, the woman I'd loved with everything I had. And in that moment, I knew there was no saving this. There was no going back. Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there. I went to the guest bedroom and lay down, feeling numb, hollow. My mind raced with thoughts of everything we'd been through, every moment we'd shared, every promise we'd made. And I realized that the woman I loved was gone, replaced by someone who didn't care if I lived or died. That night, I decided to leave her. After that night, I knew there was no coming back from this. Jessica's words haunted me, echoing in my mind like a broken record. "You're going to die soon anyway, so there's no point in hiding my affairs anymore." I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, that cold indifference in her eyes, like I was just an obstacle in her way, something she'd outgrown and discarded. She didn't even try to deny it, didn't try to soften the blow. She'd made it clear that she didn't care about me, about our marriage, or even about the damage this would do to our kids. I spent the next few days in a daze, going through the motions but feeling like a hollow version of myself. I'd look at Emma and Jack, their innocent faces oblivious to the storm brewing around them, and it broke my heart. They didn't deserve this. They deserved a stable home, a happy family. And now, because of Jessica's selfishness, that had been ripped away from them. I started thinking about what it would mean to leave. The logistics, the impact on the kids, the fallout that would inevitably follow. It was overwhelming, but I knew staying wasn't an option. I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep letting her twist the knife every time she looked at me with that smug expression, as if she'd won some kind of sick victory. I didn't want my kids growing up in a home filled with resentment and lies. So I started making plans, quietly, without telling her. I reached out to a lawyer, explaining the situation and gathering information on my options. I wanted to be prepared to do this the right way, so I could protect my kids and make sure they'd still feel safe and loved, even if our family was splitting apart. The lawyer was sympathetic, calm, and practical, walking me through the steps, assuring me that I had a strong case. She told me I could file for custody, given Jessica's erratic behavior, and that I could build a new life with Emma and Jack, free from the toxic environment Jessica had created. One night, after the kids were asleep, I sat down in the living room with Jessica, feeling a strange sense of calm. I'd made my decision, and for the first time in months, I felt in control of my own life. Jessica, I began, keeping my voice steady, I think it's time we talk about where this is going. She barely looked up from her phone, her face lit by the cold blue glow of the screen. Oh, are we doing this again? She muttered, sounding bored. What's there to talk about, Jack? I thought you'd already figured it out. Her indifference fueled something in me, a resolve I didn't know I had. I'm filing for divorce, I said quietly, watching her face for any reaction. I can't keep living like this, and neither can the kids. They deserve better than this, better than you. That got her attention. She looked up, her eyes narrowing, and for the first time, I saw something that almost resembled anger. Excuse me, she snapped, putting her phone down. You think you're taking my kids away from me? I felt a surge of strength, like the weight I'd been carrying was finally lifting. I'm taking them away from this, I said, gesturing around us. From this toxic mess you've turned our marriage into. I don't want them growing up thinking this is normal, that this is what love looks like. She laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. You're pathetic, Jack. Really? You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Playing the wounded husband, the good dad, who just wants to save his kids. It's all about your ego. I ignored her words, refusing to let her get under my skin. This isn't about me, I replied firmly. It's about Emma and Jack. They deserve stability, a real home where they're loved and respected. Jessica leaned back, crossing her arms, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Good luck with that, Jack. Courts don't take kids away from their mothers just because their fathers throw a tantrum. She was trying to intimidate me, to make me feel small, but it didn't work. I'd reached my limit, and there was no going back. I don't want to fight, Jessica. I just want to do what's best for the kids. We can make this as easy or as hard as you want, but I'm not backing down. Her expression changed, a flicker of something that looked like genuine fear passing over her face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same cold indifference. Fine, she spat, standing up and grabbing her purse. Do what you want, Jack, but don't expect me to make it easy for you. And with that, she stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. After she left, I sat there in silence, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. I knew that leaving her was going to be a battle, that she'd fight me every step of the way, but I felt a strange sense of peace. I'd made my choice, and there was no turning back. I was finally taking control of my life, and for the first time, I felt hopeful. Over the next few weeks, I started making arrangements. I met with the lawyer again, discussing custody plans and preparing the paperwork for the divorce. I didn't tell Jessica about any of it. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much thought I was putting into this. I kept things civil, focusing on the kids and keeping up appearances. But inside, I was preparing for a life without her. Then, one evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, Emma looked up at me, her little face serious. Daddy, why doesn't Mommy love you anymore? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I struggled to find the right words, knowing I couldn't lie to her, but also not wanting to burden her with the truth. Sweetheart, I said gently, stroking her hair, sometimes grown-ups stop being happy together, but it doesn't mean they don't love you. She nodded, looking thoughtful, and I kissed her on the forehead, holding back the wave of emotions threatening to break free. I didn't want my kids to see my pain, to feel like they were caught in the middle of something they couldn't understand. All I wanted was to protect them, to shield them from the chaos Jessica had created. A week later, I served Jessica the divorce papers. She was furious, of course, throwing a tantrum and accusing me of trying to steal her life. But I was prepared. I stood my ground, refusing to let her manipulate me anymore. I'd already seen the worst of her, heard her say things I'd never forget, and nothing she could do or say now would change my mind. She tried to guilt-trip me, accusing me of abandoning her, of giving up on our marriage. But I'd had enough. I'd given her every chance to fix things, every opportunity to make amends, and she'd thrown it all away. Now, it was my turn to walk away. As the legal process unfolded, Jessica became even more vicious. She tried to paint me as the bad guy, accusing me of forcing her into infidelity by working too much, by not caring about her needs. She even went as far as to spread rumors among our friends, telling them I was controlling and emotionally abusive. But I didn't let it get to me. I had the truth on my side, and I knew that eventually people would see through her lies. The court battle was exhausting, emotionally and financially. Jessica fought hard, trying to secure as much custody and financial support as she could. But my lawyer was prepared, armed with evidence of her behavior, her blatant disregard for our marriage, and her toxic influence on the kids. After months of back and forth, the judge ruled in my favor, granting me primary custody of Emma and Jack. The relief I felt was indescribable. I'd finally done it. I'd fought for my kids, for our future, and I'd won. Jessica still had visitation rights, of course, but the kids would be with me most of the time. I could finally give them the stable, loving home they deserved, without the shadow of Jessica's betrayal hanging over us. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild our lives. We moved to a new house, a smaller place but cozy and filled with warmth. I focused on the kids, on healing, on creating new routines and memories that didn't involve the pain of the past. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what Jessica was hiding. I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to keep her happy. I was free. And as I looked at Emma and Jack, playing happily in our new home, I realized that I'd done the right thing. I'd taken control of my life, stood up for myself, and protected my kids from a toxic environment. It wasn't easy, but I'd survived. And now, I could finally look forward to the future, knowing that we were safe, loved, and ready to start again. The months after the divorce felt like waking up from a long nightmare. Life was far from perfect, but it was peaceful, and that was enough for me. I finally had a place where my kids and I could be safe, where I didn't have to constantly look over my shoulder or wonder what kind of chaos Jessica would stir up next. Our new home wasn't as big or as fancy as the house we'd shared, but it was ours. It felt like a fresh start, and I was determined to make it the foundation for a stable, loving home. The kids were adjusting as best as they could. Emma had always been sensitive, picking up on tensions even before I could see them myself, so I knew she'd been carrying more of this burden than I'd realized. Jack, younger and a bit more oblivious, seemed to bounce back quicker, but he still asked about his mom and why things had changed. It was hard to explain to them why their mother wasn't around as much anymore, but I made sure they knew it wasn't their fault. I reminded them daily that they were loved, that they were safe, and that I would always be there for them. Jessica still had visitation rights, and at first, I worried she'd try to use those visits as a way to manipulate the kids, maybe even poison them against me. But she barely showed up. In the beginning, she called to set something up with them, only to cancel last minute, citing some urgent reason or another. Eventually, the calls started coming less frequently and then stopped almost entirely. It broke my heart to see Emma and Jack's confusion and disappointment, but I realized it was better this way. Better for them to know that they had one stable parent who was there for them, no matter what. I remember one particular evening that really drove it all home. I was tucking Emma into bed, and she looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes and said, "Daddy, do you think Mommy will ever come home?" The question felt like a dagger to the chest, but I tried to stay calm. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said gently, "but I know that I'll always be here for you and Jack, no matter what." She seemed to think about that for a moment before nodding, looking more at peace than I'd seen her in a while. "That's good," she said simply, before pulling me in for a hug. In that moment, I realized that as painful as this journey had been, I'd made the right choice. My kids needed stability, and even if it was hard, I was determined to be that for them. I started focusing more on rebuilding myself, too. For so long, my life had been wrapped up in Jessica and the pain she caused. Now that she was out of the picture, I could finally breathe. I took time to reconnect with old friends, people I'd unintentionally pushed away during the marriage because I was so wrapped up in managing the chaos at home. I started going to the gym, rediscovering hobbies I'd abandoned, and even went to therapy to process everything that had happened. It was tough, confronting the depths of betrayal and the impact it had on me, but it was freeing. I was finally letting go of the past, making room for a future that was my own. And then, one day, I got an unexpected call. It was Jessica's mother. We'd had a strained relationship over the years. She'd always been kind to me, but as Jessica became more distant and erratic, her mother had backed off, as if she didn't know how to deal with her own daughter's choices. I hadn't heard from her in over a year, so the call was a surprise. "Jack," she began, her voice tentative. I know it's been a while, and I don't mean to intrude, but I thought you should know. Jessica is not doing well." I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, pity, and something that felt almost like closure. "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied cautiously, not sure what she was getting at. She sighed, her voice thick with sadness. "She's been struggling. After the divorce, she started drinking heavily, lost her job, and, well, she's not in a good place. I just thought, maybe the kids should know. Or, I don't know, maybe you could talk to her." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Jessica had put me through hell, destroyed our family, and made it clear that she didn't care about me or the kids. But part of me still felt for her, for the woman I'd once loved, the mother of my children. "I'll think about it," I said finally, not committing to anything. I wasn't sure if I was ready to open that door again, even from a distance. Jessica's mother thanked me, and we hung up, leaving me with a lot to think about. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything that had happened, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, if maybe I'd missed signs earlier on. But I knew that was a trap. Jessica had made her choices, and I'd done everything I could to hold our family together. I'd given her every chance to make things right, and she'd thrown it all away. The next morning, I sat Emma and Jack down and gently explained that their mom was going through a rough time. I kept it simple, focusing on the fact that she loved them but needed space to work on herself. They took it surprisingly well, and I could see the understanding in their eyes. They were young, but they'd already had to grow up faster than most kids their age. The months rolled on, and our life began to settle into a comfortable routine. The kids were doing well in school, making friends, and finding joy in the little things again. I found myself smiling more, laughing more, genuinely enjoying life in a way I hadn't in years. The past still lingered, but it no longer held me captive. I was free, and I was determined to build a future for myself and my kids that was filled with love and stability. Then, just as I'd finally put Jessica behind me, something happened that threw everything into chaos once again. One evening, 5 years after the divorce, I got a call. The number was unfamiliar, and at first, I thought it might be a telemarketer. But something told me to answer. I picked up, and on the other end was a voice I hadn't heard in years, Jessica's. "Jack," she said, her voice shaky and soft, almost unrecognizable. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Please." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I hadn't prepared for this. I'd spent years moving on, building a new life, letting go of the pain she'd caused. And now, out of nowhere, she was back, asking for my attention. I wanted to hang up, to tell her that she'd made her choice and that I was done. But something in her voice stopped me. "What is it, Jessica?" I asked cautiously, my guard up. She took a shaky breath, and for the first time, I heard something I hadn't expected: regret. "I've made so many mistakes, Jack. I've hurt you and the kids in ways I can't even begin to make up for. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know the truth." I felt my heart racing, a mix of anger and curiosity. "The truth about what?" I demanded, feeling that familiar ache in my chest. the scars she'd left still raw, even after all this time. Jessica's voice trembled as she spoke, her words tumbling out in a broken, desperate confession. When I said that thing to you about dying, I was cruel. I was angry, lost. And I lied to you about something else, something big. I thought it would hurt you, but it only ended up hurting me too. What are you talking about? I asked, my patience wearing thin. I didn't want her excuses or her guilt. I just wanted to move on. She took a deep breath, and finally, she said it. Jack, the thing with the DNA test. I lied. I manipulated the results. I was so angry, so spiteful, that I wanted to make you feel pain. But Tommy is your son. He's always been your son. I'm sorry. I know it's too late, but I'm so sorry. The world seemed to tilt, her words sinking in, leaving me stunned. For years, I'd believed that my own son wasn't mine. I'd buried that pain, convinced myself I was better off without her lies. And now, after all this time, she was admitting the truth, that she'd played me, manipulated me, stolen the most fundamental truth from me out of sheer malice. I didn't know what to say. I felt numb, betrayed all over again, but somehow freed. I had known deep down, I think, that no DNA test could change how much I loved my son. But hearing the truth, finally, was like ripping off an old, festering wound. In that moment, I knew one thing for sure. I would never forgive Jessica, but I was done letting her hold any power over me. Thank you for telling me the truth, I said, my voice calm. But this changes nothing between us. I've moved on. My life, my family, are no longer yours to hurt. And with that, I hung up, feeling the final weight lift. I was free. Finally, truly free. After that phone call, I sat in silence, trying to process what Jessica had just told me. I stared at the wall, numb with a mixture of anger and relief. I had spent years carrying the weight of her betrayal, believing that my own son might not be mine, that I'd been tricked into loving a child who wasn't biologically connected to me. And now, after all this time, she was telling me that it had all been a lie. Tommy was mine. He always had been. The flood of emotions was almost too much to handle. There was anger, yes, anger that she'd taken such a cruel route just to hurt me, anger that she'd lied to me about something so fundamental, so core to my identity as a father. But there was also a strange feeling of liberation. For years, I'd struggled with this gnawing doubt, wondering if I was somehow less of a father to Tommy. Now, finally, I had my answer, and it felt like a missing piece of myself had clicked back into place. I went to Tommy's room that night and watched him as he slept, his little chest rising and falling, completely oblivious to the storm that had just been lifted. I felt tears in my eyes as I realized that, in a way, Jessica had set me free. Her confession was a painful reminder of her cruelty, but it had given me something I'd needed all along: closure. The next day, I decided I wouldn't let Jessica's words disrupt the life I had built. I had spent too long letting her hold power over me, letting her lies dictate my feelings and my sense of self-worth. I was done with that. I was free now, and I intended to live my life fully, without the shadow of her betrayal looming over me. I thought long and hard about whether to tell the kids, especially Tommy, about the DNA lie. But as I looked at them, I realized there was no point. Tommy knew me as his dad, and that was all that mattered. Telling him would only hurt and confuse him, reopening wounds that didn't need to be revisited. So I decided to keep that truth to myself. Jessica had already done enough damage to our family. I wasn't going to let her ruin the peace we'd finally found. This was my family now, and I'd protect it with everything I had. Life after that call took on a new clarity. I found myself letting go of so much anger, not just toward Jessica, but toward myself. For years, I'd blamed myself for the breakdown of our marriage. I'd questioned my choices, my work schedule, my dedication as a husband. I thought that maybe if I'd done something differently, been more attentive, worked less, been more romantic, anything, then maybe she wouldn't have strayed. But after that call, I realized that it wasn't my fault. Jessica's actions were hers alone. She'd made choices, and no amount of my self-sacrifice would have changed that. I'd given her everything I had, and it was enough. She was the one who'd thrown it all away. With that realization, I started focusing on rebuilding my confidence and trust in myself. I spent more time doing things that made me happy, things I hadn't done in years because I'd been so consumed with holding the family together. I went fishing, a hobby I'd loved in my 20s, and even took Emma and Jack along. They loved it, and it became a new tradition for us. We'd pack up sandwiches and sodas and spend hours by the lake, talking and laughing and just being together. Emma was growing up fast, and she'd recently started middle school. She was sharp, quick-witted, and had a sensitivity about her that reminded me a lot of myself. She could see right through people's masks, could pick up on little details that others missed. I knew she'd seen through Jessica's facade long before the divorce, and sometimes I caught her watching me with this look of quiet understanding. She knew I was healing, and she was right there with me. Jack, on the other hand, was a ball of energy, always running, always asking questions. He'd started to develop a love for basketball, and we'd spend weekends playing one-on-one in the driveway. He'd inherited my competitive streak, and every game with him was a battle. But win or lose, I cherished those moments. They were the things Jessica couldn't take from me, the pieces of my life that had survived the wreckage. As the years went by, I slowly allowed myself to open up to the possibility of new love. It wasn't easy. Trust didn't come naturally to me anymore, and the idea of letting someone into my life, someone who might hurt me again, terrified me. But I knew I couldn't let Jessica's betrayal define the rest of my life. I didn't want to live in fear, closed off from the world, holding onto old pain. Then I met Emily. She was a friend of a friend, someone who came into my life when I wasn't looking for anything. Emily was calm, gentle, and genuine in a way that I hadn't seen in a long time. She'd been through her own share of heartache, and in a way that drew us together. We'd both been hurt, both learned hard lessons about love and trust, and yet we were both hopeful, cautiously optimistic that happiness was still possible. We started out as friends, taking things slow, meeting for coffee or the occasional lunch. She never pushed, never asked for more than I was willing to give. And that patience, that quiet support, was exactly what I needed. Over time, I found myself opening up to her, sharing pieces of my past, the pain and betrayal, the things I'd kept buried. She listened without judgment, holding space for my story, allowing me to heal in my own way. Emily became a steady presence in my life, and over time, she grew close to Emma and Jack as well. She never tried to replace Jessica. She respected the boundaries I'd set, letting the kids warm up to her on their own terms. And they did. Emma admired her kindness and honesty, and Jack loved her sense of humor. Watching them bond with her was like watching new roots grow, grounding our family in a future I hadn't thought possible. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table laughing and sharing stories, I realized something that brought me full circle. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, truly living. And this was a life I could be proud of, a life built on love, honesty, and trust. The very things Jessica had taken from me but that I'd managed to reclaim. In the end, Jessica had given me a painful but invaluable lesson. That love isn't always enough if it's not built on respect, integrity, and mutual care. I'd walked through fire, but I'd come out stronger. I'd protected my kids, rebuilt my self-worth, and created a future I was proud of. If I could give advice to anyone going through a similar struggle, it would be this. Never lose sight of your own worth. Don't let someone else's betrayal define you. You are stronger than you know, and with time, you can heal. Life does go on, and so does love. The key is to build it with someone who deserves it, someone who will honor and cherish it in a way that brings out the best in you. Looking at Emily, Emma, and Jack, I finally felt at peace. I knew that, no matter what, we'd be okay. We'd built a new life together, one that was stronger, happier, and more resilient than anything I could have imagined.